Hey there, I'm Ryan and welcome to today's landscape tutorial. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon, where you can also get access to the ebooks, bonus lessons, art critiques. There's a lot up there to help aid you in your creative and artistic endeavors, but with that, let's jump into today's tutorial and get creative together.
We are going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we'll dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, then proceed to wipe off the excess. That way we can keep our paint wet for a longer period of time and just help the blending process. That said, we're going to begin here with some pale terracotta. You can also use a pale rose blush, anything that's fairly muted. Then quite a bit of titanium white and a hint of deep violet. Now this will be the color that we instigate for the backing clouds. So you can see all of these detail ones that I've worked into the foreground. We're just working around them, or at least the foreground of our skyscape. And I'm using a larger flat-headed brush because I want to be able to deliver a lot of paint fairly quickly. Again, to work around dry times, and this one's great for that. It also has nice sharp edges to work in the crevices of our clouds. And we're just finding our way around those edges initially, though we will soon start to work in and out. So, we'll go for a little bit of a blend. We don't want our edges to be hard, so I'm relieving pressure as I move out into the negative space. Now from here, we can change our pigment, work in quite a bit of that deep violet. Going to work this around the edges before I start the blending process. And then once it's around all of said edges, we can start bringing it in. This will leave a fairly saturated purple hue, but we can desaturate it with a little bit of Mars black in there as well. That with the titanium white will render something also a bit more muted. So let's add that. Just a hint of Mars black. It's a very strong pigment. And much like the last application, we start predominantly on our edges before we start the real blend, because we don't want to take all of this and bring it back up there. Not right now. I'm also trying to leave some brush strokes within the sky here, as you can see. That way it looks like the clouds are moving. That said, let's desaturate. More Mars black, deep violet, titanium white. Let's make it a bit brighter. We'll just go back and forth with our pigments a couple of times. I think that looks quite nice. Oh, that's beautiful actually. You can see how muted it is in relation to everything else, and I'm covering up a lot of the clouds up here. It's okay. Then we can start working it in. You can see that it's starting to get a little bit more difficult to blend as this pigment begins to dry. It's okay. We're doing more than one layer anyway, because that'll make it look a lot more professional. My brush strokes are still moving in this general direction. So now we'll start working in the opposite way, so we'll brighten. You can see this mix, again, much more muted. You have the option of going with the more vibrant, the more muted. It's subjective, it's art. I think typically it looks a little bit more realistic if we opt for the muted palette, but You don't have to. And I wanted to show you what both looked like. You have the opportunity to play with both through multiple layers. Now, my brush is very dark right now, right? There's a lot of pigment on it. I'm going to clean it off to the best of my ability, just add a little bit of water. That way when I come back in with my new mix, I can render something a lot brighter than what I would have been able to had the brush still been so muddy. So I'll work this again into those edges and softly out. Try to hold my brush a little bit farther back. As we get within the details here, it's quite natural to want to grip it more like a pencil, but the farther back you hold your brush, typically the better it'll be. So, continuing to make this brighter, we add more of that pale terracotta, less of the violet, but the violet is still present in the mix. You can see just how much better this looks with layer 2. So much thicker. The colors a bit more unique. And again, I'm trying to work my way up, relieving pressure on that top of the stroke. There we go. And then just interjecting some brush strokes throughout to give it a bit more movement, make it dynamic. Slowly build out that center. This is where that lightning is going to be. This is all illuminated by the lightning. And we'll work it up here too. Starting to look really pretty. Then because we're keeping our brush damp, I'm continuously dipping it in a little bit of water, wiping off the excess, then coming back to the paint. We are keeping it wet. And these mixes are easier for it. Again, apologies if my hand keeps getting in the way. Here, starting to give it a bit more prominent with our actual brush strokes. But I think I'm quite happy with the way this is looking. Now we can do that, work that in. Perfect. Okay, let's get a little bit closer. Now towards the top, we'll be painting another cloud which is overlapping all of these more distant clouds. And with that, we will begin more of our violet, Mars black, and titanium white. We want a gray purple, essentially. And we want it to be fairly dark towards the top. So we can begin with that. Just going to get my edges, give us a little bit of a vignette effect. The eye innately goes to the brightest point of any piece, so if you make the corners a bit darker, the edges, it's a good subconscious way of bringing the viewer's eye inwards. Then, we'll make it a little bit brighter with both titanium white and a hint of the terracotta or pale rose hue. We'll work that all the way across, just horizontally at first. But then we'll start bringing it down over and into our last applications. That said, a lot of it is going to look thin up here because we only have one layer in comparison to everything else. And when I'm doing my blends down, as you can see, I'm really softening my brush stroke so that I don't have a hard edge for these clouds. So just because our brush has a sharp edge doesn't mean that we have to render one. Now, as noted, the first layer, quite thin, so we will thicken that up with a second application, and with a second, of course, we have an opportunity to course correct a little bit in terms of our hues, our values, really any way of rendering it. And I think I want mine to be slightly more muted. So here you can see this is a bit more gray than what we were working with. It's also a bit more thick because the titanium white and Mars black, while they make it gray, they also do a great job of muting it, desaturating it. That's really what happens when you desaturate it, right? It just becomes a bit more gray. I'm going to bleed this down here a little bit, that way it's nice and cohesive. I'm working my brush in a slightly rounded application here, that way it's softer. But we can also interject various highlights from the lightning and whatnot up into it. So we can add some of that brighter pigment towards the bottom, but then also splash it in up higher. We essentially want this in areas that are protruding and therefore light from the lightning can have an impact. There we go. Just slowly building it out. I say slowly. It's more of a measured application because we are still trying to work within dry times. This is drying. I can feel it getting slightly more gritty on my brush. So we're just intuitively going at it. Because of people's various climates, dry time will also alter, right? I'm in Ontario, Canada, and it's winter. So I probably have a bit of a different setting than quite a few of you. And that does affect dry time. But again, with the aid of additional water in your mixes, you can offset that. Making that nice and voluminous right through there. Every time we make it brighter as well, we make these edges a bit softer so they can sink in to that background, kind of bridge the gap in terms of depth. Lots of softening, applying very little pressure right now. It's fully dry to the touch, so we're going to go in with one final layer. This one's going to be a bit more of a transitional layer. Bridge that gap so that it's not such a dramatic change between the two. Speaking of dramatic changes, I'm not sure if you can tell, the sun just went behind a cloud, which did make this all a little bit darker. it's fun to paint on days like these where it's bright and then it's not, and then it's bright and then it's not, because then you get to see what your painting looks like on a cloudy day, on a bright day, going back and forth, so you just get a bit more information, right? That said, this is much brighter. We're looking for more of a middle ground between our last pigment and this. So we don't go with the first pigment we mix. We do a little bit of trial and error. This definitely needs more purple. Try that. Still needs a bit more purple. Make sure that you get a wide mix. That way you don't have little portions on your brush that are not the correct color. I think this is a great transition for the bottom. You can see just how nicely it blends in right there. And I am currently working with wet on dry. So the canvas entirely is dry, but I'm still getting some soft blends because I have water on my brush. Make the bottom of this as a whole significantly brighter. And I don't think the last layer looked bad at all. In fact, I liked it a lot. But I really want to show you that you can go with a much more dramatic look, like the last layer, or you can go with a brighter look, like this one. It's all about how you want to approach it. And we can even keep some of those darker hues towards the top, or we can go over them very softly, like this. And if it gets a little too granular, a little bit too textured, you can always go back in with a darker hue that we had at the top. We can also, and this is going to be fun, expand this area, because likely in the 3 layers here, we brought it down, we brought it down, we brought it down. We can bring it back up. I'm going to show you how we go about that. So we're just remixing the pigment that we had down here. We'll do a little test. It needs to be more saturated. So we add in the Terracotta, the deep violet, do another test. You can see it's a bit more yellow. We'll lean into the violet. And there we go. So now that we have this pigment, we can splash it out and up here. Do softer blends towards the edges. We did just add a new layer to the top here, so we can do some wet into dry. Leaving slight openings to a point. I know it looks a little bit messy right now, just trust me. Trust the process. Larger skies can be a little tricky, and I think learning patience is so important with them. Because they can look amazing if you just trust yourself, the process. You go in with an idea of what you want it to be. You have an understanding of the subject. Right? That wider compilation of ideas. Now we'll go back to the pigment that we used right above it, and we'll use that to blend down. Act as that connective tissue between the top and our latest applications. Now we'll take a step back and go back to the pigment that we used down here, just do a little test where we've previously incorporated it. And then I'm going to continue working downwards in the painting, back to the habit of using the corner to work around all of the details for the clouds that I'm going to have right around here. And we'll paint those in with a different brush a little bit later on, but right now we just need to instigate these lighter areas. And because they're lighter, when we work in the darker clouds, they'll have a great pop to them. There we go. That said, as we start to move downwards, we are going to need to start blending into a new pigment. That is going to be a very deep, dark purple. So a little bit of titanium white because we don't want it to be too saturated, but a lot of Mars black and a lot of our deep violet. And we'll start applying that down here towards the bottom. Work that around our clouds. I typically like to do a lot of the edge work first before working into the larger open areas because it's much easier to paint detail when your brush is with new paint and a little bit damp. So I just like to do this first, and then we'll continue it up here. Get the excess paint off of our brush by just working around this foliage, and then very softly we'll work our way in to the brighter pigment that we have above it. I am going to lose a little bit of my clouds. It's okay, we can always go back and redraw them. If you're up on Patreon, you can just use the traceable. Make it really easy. I'm just going to get some of that line work out through there. And then we'll continue down, but we'll do so with a new pigment. That being our Ultramarine Blue. Also from Winsor & Newton. Not sponsored, just big fan of the paint. In terms of materials, you can also get the brushes that I use. I know that I've only used one so far in this lesson, but you can get those in the description. They are entirely vegan and cruelty-free. They are the brushes of the channel. I'm very proud of them. But as you can see, we have that ultramarine blue now worked in. Got a slightly different hue than we did before. It's adding some nice diversity to the pigments. Let's grab more of that. Work it around the tree-filled mountains and hills in the background. Work it up into the smaller portions as well. And we want to make sure that we have a nice thick application. If you make the edges slightly soft around the edges where your clouds are going to be, that'll also be useful later on. So I'm just doing a little bit of a tap. Now we are going to switch our brush to the filbert, which is a lot smaller, but it also has rounded edges, which lets you blend really softly into these fully dry layers. With that, we're going to brighten up portions in here that the lightning is going to illuminate. So I'm going to start with a little bit of our titanium white, this pigment right here. Smallest hint of the purple. And we're just going to work typically in this direction. So it's a bit of an angled application. And we soften, in the very least, the bottom, And I'm doing that by doing a little bit of a rounded motion with the corner of the brush, which is also rounded. So it gives us this nice soft aesthetic through there. But this will essentially really be the clouds brightening up as that lightning comes down through this portion. And this is why I was saying earlier, you really need to trust in the process, trust in yourself, because this is an integral part of the sky that we're doing quite late into that process, right? Just because we have to for layering purposes. But it's a piece that really helps it all come together. We can have a lot of light right through here. Softening. Softening. My brush is quite damp. We can do little bits of this light throughout that don't necessarily connect to all of this, but when I do that, they are even softer, so there isn't even a hard top to it. And we'll just bring a little bit, but not too much down here, because this is where it ends, essentially. And we can build it up through multiple layers so that it's nice and thick, so that we don't have the darker purplish blue showing through. Do need to be careful with the titanium white. Though we can't make this too bright because we don't want it to compete too dramatically with the actual lightning. Speaking of lightning, here in Toronto, Ontario, last night we had a snowstorm, but there was a lightning. And it was a really unique experience. A lot of thunder, a lot of snow, a lot of lightning. I think I like this as it is for now. I'm going to take a couple steps back. Something I recommend in the painting process often is removing yourself for 5 minutes, taking steps back from the painting, and then coming right back to it so that you get to see it with fresh eyes a little bit and then make a more informed decision from there. Okay, so once all of that is dry, we're going to switch brushes yet again to a liner brush. This one's quite small, fantastic for detail work specifically, like with lightning. So I've drawn in my lightning using a little bit of Conte, and we'll start to actually render it with titanium white and a little bit of our terracotta. Now this pigment needs to be brighter than what we have here, but also not the brightest pigment possible because we want to be able to brighten this. I'm using a lot of water in my mix. That way, A, it goes down semi-transparent so I can build it up where I want to, but also so that I can get the smallest application possible, as the water will help condense the bristles of the brush, make them really nice and tight. Already going over areas twice. There's a bit of a flash of light that's going to happen right behind this cloud that's yet to be painted, so I'll expand upon these markings, working a little bit of a circular motion to get it to be a softer transition outwards. You can also do a little bit of finger painting. If you watch the channel once or twice, you probably know I feel you never be too old for that. Said, we'll also start working down. I'm not trying to make elongated strokes. It's essentially a series of a lot of taps. That way the lightning gets a bit more of a jolting look. I think lightning looks a little bit awkward often when it's done through elongated intentional strokes. So this is how we keep it a bit more segmented, have those unique lines. Dissipates as we move down. Again, it's all quite thin at this point, but it won't be as we continue to proceed. There we go. The reference photo doesn't have the lightning moving down too far, but I do like that grander motion. Now we'll make it even brighter. And you know what? I'll get the camera a bit closer for you. So, we'll jump back into it. Make sure that we are focused. And now I'll head into the middle, try to get an even smaller application. Blend it out into the edges. You can see I'm going in with just a bit of a tap for the most part. I'm going to get some extra water. The places in which the lightning diverges, I like to make that a little bit brighter. So here, during any of the joints, so the areas where they cross paths. We can also have little offshoots. And I'm changing the initial application minorly here and there. And I have that leeway because we went in with such a semi-transparent initial application. Things weren't really set in stone. Going up for the third application here. I think we'll cover a lot of this with clouds, but just in case not, I'll work in the rest of these. You can also add to our glow. So you go in with a lot of water and then you blend it out. It works best when the pigment around it is fully dry. But as you can see, we can essentially add light very simply. Give it a nice little glow effect. You do need to make sure that the pigment you're applying is incredibly wet though, to the point where it's almost all water with very little pigment. But it can make some visual magic. Oh, it's getting quite dark in here, which is nice because you get to really see the contrast and the glow. Again, benefits of painting on cloudy days. Lots of finger painting through here. And I'm doing it more so towards the larger body rather than the bottom of the offshoots, because there's simply more light happening here, right? Through that, you might want to further define portions Make them sharp again. This part's kind of getting lost in the cloud. We can come back to the lightning and enhance it a little bit later once we figure out how bright everything else is going to be. But for now, I want to start working in these clouds. And we're going to start with rendering a purple that's fairly similar to what we have here. And we have a little bit of it still showing on the palette. Like to keep just a hint of each mix showing somewhere. That way we can find it again fairly easily should we need to. And this is, of course, being led by the violet, but we have a little bit of the terracotta. We have the titanium white and the Mars black because we do need to desaturate it a little bit. We can do a test up here, just see how it is, and I can tell already it's far too dark. So we have two pigments that can brighten it, the titanium white and the terracotta, or the pale rose blush, whichever you choose. That said, with this, when you're making the decision, if you choose the titanium white, you're going to desaturate it. If you choose the terracotta, you're going to change the hue a little bit to be more so akin to what we have for the light. So I'm actually going to continue to brighten it just a little bit with that terracotta because I like in this area more of that brighter, slightly warmer hue coming through. I'm working with the filbert brush because I want those soft edges. And I'm working with these rounded little strokes towards the edges to accomplish that. I've drawn in my clouds yet again using some Conte, spelled C-O-N-T-E. Love working with it as my drawing tool after I have acrylic on the canvas already because you can associate different colors with it, but it's very easy to remove with just a little bit of water. So you don't have to worry about those lines showing up later down the road. You can see that I'm starting by just working my edges. It's a visually messier way to work, but again, we have the best opportunity to render sharp, definitive markings and intentional markings. They don't even have to be sharp, but intentional markings when you have a damp brush and clean pigment on it. So I'm just taking this opportunity to render these, and then we can work more into the bulk and the bodies after. Also, by layering these clouds in front of the lightning, we create an extra element of depth, which is nice. Now let's mix more of that pigment, still using the titanium white, Mars black, terracotta, and deep violet. Let's make it a little bit brighter for those edges. For layer 2, just brighten it up because that lightning will be working its way around the backs, the side that we don't see of these clouds, and it'll illuminate the edges a little bit. So in the areas that are essentially present to the lightning, we just brighten. That said, we definitely need to do quite a bit of layering because this is very thin, as you can see. But we're creating those softer transitions. And there goes the light, perhaps. Oh, that's a big cloud outside. Not quite as daunting as what we are currently presenting here, but certainly having an impact. Once I have some of these associated, I'll show you the next step. We render a darker variant, so more Mars black than before, a bit more titanium white rather than the terracotta for the center of them, because we're not going to have as much light from the lightning, right? So mix that up. And that, as you can see, far too saturated, right? It doesn't match any of the other purples. So we need to desaturate it. That means we need titanium white and Mars black. Sometimes it's just one. Here, I think we need both. Much better. We're still blending with it, so it's a little bit more saturated than what I'd love. But we can get that brighter variant that we used for the edges. Work that in and around. You can see that we're starting to render some real volume in the cloud, make it three-dimensional. Using the rounded edges to make it a bit more definitive. I'll work this into the center of this cloud as well. Letting the edges still be nice and bright. We can also use the sharper point of this to work through these smaller areas. But you don't have to make all of the clouds as dense as these. Some of them can be a bit brighter. You know what? I might go back and soften this middle portion just a little bit, so that we have some additional changes, variants. Apply this nice soft edge here. Soften that. A lot of detail work at this point. Let's start filling in this body. So, a lot of our violet, but even more of our titanium white and Mars black. A little bit of the terracotta still. Not as much, because when we are, remember, in the middle of the clouds, we lean heavier on titanium white. And we definitely need to lean heavier on it yet again. There we go. We'll give that a try. I think it looks quite nice, but I think it could be a little bit brighter even still. And we're really desaturating it, so I'll work in the terracotta and the violet. Perfect. That's what I really wanted. Build up our layers in the middle of other clouds as well, so that it's cohesive. And we can't just do this pigment for these larger middle sections, because it's too big to the point where it lacks a little bit of depth with just the current hue that we have for it, the current value that we have for it. So we will go back to that in just a second by taking some extra Mars black, not much, maybe a little bit of the Ultramarine Blue, not much, working that into this back area. Alright, so it's coming along quite nicely, but we do need to continue working our edges. So I'm just applying this brighter pigment that we previously established using the filbert brush. Right through there, leaving little openings for the sky where we can. Just trying to make it more unique. And the reference photo is actually fantastic for this. Again, if you need help with drawing the clouds and all of that, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon. It's a great way to support the channel. but it also lets you get access to the traceables, the reference photos, pictures of all of the materials. We have my ebooks up there, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. Also, ebooks full of other traceables for days where you want to make something, but you're not entirely sure what they really want that to be. On top of that, we also have access to an exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their artwork, all of their different renditions of these lessons. It's a really inspiring place with a really positive and supportive and informed and like absolutely wonderful community that I can't ever stop saying how proud of I am. And you can also get access to art critiques from me up there, where we film them, and it's a positive experience where we kind of talk about what's working really well, what we can bring into additional pieces, maybe what we can improve on. Sometimes I'll Photoshop the painting so that you get to see different variants, different palettes you could have chosen, fun things like that. So if you're interested in any of it, link to Patreon is in the video description, where you can also find the brush set. But I think these clouds are coming along really nicely. This current mix is slightly darker, so I'm just working it into the edges, because as we talked about beforehand, we're trying to work in a bit of a vignette, bring the eye towards the center of the painting. This also just allows us to build up a little bit of extra volume in the larger portions. Working in a rounded application, leaving little areas that are brighter. This will just give the clouds a more unique shape in an area that would have otherwise been almost silhouetted. Makes it a bit more visually dramatic too, which is nice. And then we can also soften areas, should we want to, and just go back and forth with it in the same way we have been the rest of the piece. Really enjoy painting clouds. They used to be, I think, the hardest thing for me to paint. But it really is one of those subjects where you have to go into it without fear. You tell yourself, you know what, if it doesn't look amazing on the first try, that's okay. I'll just do another layer. And every layer we add makes the painting a little bit more professional, a little bit more complete. We learn something with every layer. And the lessons you learn from a painting are often so much more valuable than the actual painting itself, because you can take the lessons into so many paintings in the future, right? You're not just working on this painting with that lesson, you're working on all of your future ones. So when things don't go right the first time, sometimes that's incredibly valuable and wonderful. And I think having that perspective is really important as an artist. Sometimes the lessons that you see on this channel, like of this, it's not the first time I painted it. Might have painted it once, twice, maybe 3 times before. And each time I just get a little bit better, I learn something, I get better at teaching it, you know? It's all a process. An exploratory one, a fun one. Clouds down here, we can actually make them a bit brighter. We don't have to. We can. You know what? They're much brighter in the reference photo, right through here. But I don't want to overcomplicate this area because I really want to bring the eye through here. So we're going to take an artistic liberty. I'm going to make this darker. And by darker, I mean very much akin to what we have through here, but with the interjection of additional ultramarine blue, because we have that blue in the clouds down there, right? So again, filbert brush, rounded strokes. Softer movements around the edges. This is very thin. And here you can see the difference between probably 4 or 5 layers of paint and 1. And this is why we often don't go with the first layer, even if we like it, because by building it up, it can just look so much better. And we will build it up. Extra titanium white and Mars black. If I lose too much saturation, I'm okay with that because it's easy to work back in a new layer. And you can see that these pigments are significantly more thick. As a general rule, if you need to thicken a pigment, titanium white is fantastic for it. You lose saturation, so you have to accept that you're doing another layer with additional saturation, or you interject more of the actual hue into it. But I'm actually really glad we're doing this right now because I think it's an excellent example of that process. Take our time, we add a layer, and it just slowly starts to render that which we have in our head. It's not the first application, and that's okay. Acrylic painting, I find, often isn't a medium of instant gratification. It's more so gratification that's very much earned through a lot of layering and decision making, which I appreciate. I think that's kind of the thing we can feel the most accomplished in, especially in an era where, you know, we all have our smartphones and life is, for better or worse, very instantly gratifying, right? There are so many avenues and ways of doing that. But here, it kind of brings you back to really putting time and effort into something and getting that true fulfillment of completing it, making something you're proud of. Now, from there, we're going to go back to our liner brush, pick up some of the darker hue that we used in here, and we can start creating some wispy clouds that work their way out from this larger piece, right? And these are going to connect sometimes, but not all the time. This is a bit farther out. We want it to be unique, so the angles will differ as well. For instance, this is jetting up to the top left, where that's more horizontal. But we're essentially just going in and adding detail that wasn't really fully achievable using the filbert brush. And we can just slowly build onto these. I'm going to jump from cloud to cloud quite a bit. That way I don't accidentally continuously reincorporate the same ideas into the same cloud, right? Painting just from a bit farther right now, so that you can see that while there are details being incorporated, they're very subtle. We're not trying to make dramatic changes into the clouds. But I will get you closer. So here we are. You can tell all of those little details in there. We'll solidify some of the smaller ones that I have in this cloud. But this creates not only extra detail, but scale. All of a sudden these feel so much larger because there are also smaller portions of the clouds and individual clouds as well that are just tiny in comparison, right? And it's all about creating that variance. Here we can put some of these clouds in front of the lightning, just a little bit. We don't need an endless amount of these, but they certainly help here and there. And I like to start by making them really small, and then we build out when it feels appropriate. And we can even work them into the larger clouds, and when I want the stroke to be larger, I apply more pressure with the brush. It expands the bristles. Hopefully you're picking up lots of good little techniques throughout this. Here I think there's a lot of space to play, which is fun. Clouds are really one of those subjects where you can do so much or so little, and neither is right or wrong. All depends on the scene you want to craft. I think we need to make just a couple of these a little bit brighter. This one in particular. Also, we've been doing a lot of these applications, these markings, with a darker pigment. We can also do that with a lighter pigment, especially in darker areas, because they'll stand out to a greater degree. Said I don't want too much down here, because I really want the attention to be through that. There we go. Going over them a couple of times, building the layers as we do everything else. And I think, for now, I really like how much we have. So from there, we're going to switch back to the flat-headed brush, and we'll start working on the landscape towards us. So for this, we're going to grab some of our Ultramarine Blue, because we use that in the sky right down there. We'll grab some Mars Black, because we need to darken it, Titanium White, because we need to thicken and desaturate it, but it needs to be slightly darker than what we have right there. I was just looking at my reference photo, double checking. Yeah, it's darker. So we'll do that. And it'll be predominantly blue, but we'll throw in a hint of our deep violet. And we'll try applying this. Now, we can't have it be too dark, because we need this next one and this one to be even darker. So while I like this pigment, and while it definitely serves the purpose of being darker, moving us forward, it's definitely too dark, right? So what we'll do is we'll interject more Titanium White, more of that blue, and this is much brighter than what we need, but it will be blending and mixing with what we already have on the canvas. So we'll give it a shot. And just like that, it's darker, but not too dark. We found a good balance. Now this is going to be covered in trees, however, at this distance we won't actually see them. So we'll leave it with a fairly simple top. Though I will take a little bit more of that highlight, work that onto the top, because the top is reaching towards the sky. It's going to receive slightly more light. And then there's a little bit of a blend downwards. We could also have this mist going in between them as well if we want to separate, but that's something we'll kind of figure out along the way. Now for the next mix, we do need it to be darker, but we're also going to incorporate some olive green. You could also use a sap green. And We'll start working that in through here. First time using green. Getting quite a few notifications on my phone, sorry about that. Hopefully it's not too distracting. My printer decided to not work, so I wasn't able to print out the reference photo like I normally do. And I just have it up on my screen. That said, if you do have a printer, I do recommend printing out the reference photos, because then you can take your colors and apply it directly to the reference photo and test your colors before you commit them to the canvas. I found that really helped me when I was just learning color, matching, mixing, all of that. Here, by the way, I am incorporating tiny little protrusions, the implication of the tops of trees. Just using minimal pressure, that sharp edge of the brush, working my way across. Very subtle. Needs another layer, but I want it to dry before I instigate that second layer. Now for this one, it's a little bit closer, so we get more green than we had. But we're still mixing with blue. And here you can see just how thin this is because we don't have much titanium white in it. That's okay. Nothing a couple of layers won't fix. We'll get you closer for the next. So here we are, quite a bit closer. This should be dry enough that we can reapply to it, and remember it's a bit more of a blue mix, so we'll work that into the green that we had, a little bit of Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. And to be honest, this might actually do slightly better with more green in it, but I'll finish this out, take a step back and look at it. Yeah, so I think this is something that could be a bit brighter, could have a bit more green. Again, we don't always go with our first mix, and because I'm not testing on a reference photo, there's a little bit more trial and error, but that's okay. Makes it fun. So here, that went up a little bit too high, that's okay, we can just extend the tops of these a little bit. Trying to make sure that the top isn't that darker pigment, so I am having to raise it in every portion just a little bit. It's definitely closer to what we want. A little bit more titanium white. Still needs to be darker than this, but slightly more green. The brighter we make it, the more of a distinction we can see in the brush strokes, and provided they're all made vertically like this, it also creates the implication of trees, which is nice. I really like that though. I think we found our sweet spot for the most part. Then again, if you want, you can go in and tap the individual little protruding portions. Then we'll head over here, which is quite a bit more green. And just put a thick base layer in. And as we get closer, it's a mix between darker but also more innate coloring. So we have all of this blue in the background, this purplish blue because it's being reflected. But the closer you are to a subject, the more of the innate coloring you see, the more of less atmospheric light reflecting on it. So this is moving in the right direction. Put it darker at the bottom. And then we'll also just do little taps of that slightly varied pigment. We can also go in with the brighter variant, do the same thing. We don't have to cover the entirety of it with this technique, but it'll give us some protruding trees, make it more unique. And provided the bottom is in fact darker, it'll look great. That said, I think we're actually going to continue it all the way down. Create that connective tissue. And it needs to be more green towards the top, a little bit brighter. You can see just how useful this brush is still. Love it. Definitely need to do another layer through here. Okay, so now that we have those layers applied and dried, we're going to go back to our mix and make it slightly brighter. So just a little bit of titanium white worked in there. It will desaturate it, but that's okay. We have this lightning coming down. We want it to illuminate the tops of our trees to a point, not dramatically, but a little bit. It'll add dimension, and we'll do so with the liner brush, grabbing that new pigment, and we can start working on the tops, making them a little bit brighter, and I think they could be even brighter. We do this slowly and incrementally. Could be a little bit darker. Try that. And a lot of the trees that I apply initially will be done vertically here. Choosing this type of tree for this area because I like the movement that points towards the sky and the lightning, which is what we really want the eye and attention on. So we're choosing our subject specifically because it's a leading line, because it brings the viewer up to where we want. So we can bring this down through here, but I don't want it to become monotonous, and I want to do a different type of tree in the foreground. So I'm going to start tapping and creating the tops of other types of trees. We'll even come down a little bit, and then we'll intermix vertical ones yet again. That said, I'm sure it's incredibly hard for you to see any of this, so I'm going to move you in and you can see the detail work. But staying farther back, did want to know just how subtle it was, and the fact that when you are even 4 feet away, you might really not notice it. It's really for the people who are up close and paying real attention. So here we go. We'll jump right back in there. And here, you can see these little taps. Great for designating the tops of more of a foliage heavy tree. But then we'll also work some vertical strokes in there. And then go back to more of that tapped effect. Bringing it down minorly. This is something that isn't really in the reference photo. It's more so just for us to embellish and build. I like this pigment a lot. I think I actually want to move it up here. Though this is much farther away, so we're not going to see the detail in the same way. So my brush strokes are much closer together. Relieving pressure as I work my way down so that we have a slight gradient. The more we layer, of course, the brighter these applications will be, because instead of working on a dark backdrop or a very dark backdrop with semi-transparent pigment, we'll be working on a lighter layer. We can just bring this down, elaborate on it, intermix different types of trees. Trying not to make a straight line. You can see that we move up and down quite a lot. It's very intentional. And you can just keep building until you get the level of highlight and detail that you want. If you accidentally do too much, don't worry about it. It's very easy to walk backwards because this is just a very simple background. Easy to repaint, should you need to. Here, going back to more vertical. And then underneath it, we'll go with that tapped effect. But we're just trying to continuously change these applications. Make them nice and unique, and I'm bouncing around a lot as well. That way I can continuously balance both sides of the painting. Don't want too much detail over towards the left, because I don't want to draw the eye over there. I want it more center. There we go. From here, we get to do something extremely cathartic, and that's fill in all of the remaining white canvas. So for this, we're going to render the darkest green we have yet. We still want green in it. We'll use the smallest amount of titanium white, but we really are looking for a good dark base hue. So we'll begin, unlike usual, by just getting the body filled out. We're not really touching the edges yet, which is why this is a little unconventional. You can see how thin my pigment is in a lot of the broader strokes, and that's just because of the water, though it's a friendly reminder that we do need multiple layers, right? Now we'll get a little closer to the edges. And I'll show you how we do the edges a bit closer up. Now here, I'm going to just add more pigment to my mix because I want my paint to be thicker, and we're just increasing the amount of paint that we have in our ratio to water. So, with that, I'm just going to use the corner of the brush, rotate the brush, and create little protruding pieces of foliage. We're making sure that there's no white canvas showing, that there isn't an awkward edge here or there. You can also tell just how much of an impact using a more pigment heavy application over water is in relation to what we have right around it. So while we still have clean, sharply applicable pigment, I'll work my way through here, create little protrusions, deviating from the reference photo a little bit. All of it is to aid the larger movements of the painting. And now I'm at the point where I can't really render sharp markings. You can see that it definitely declines in our application ability right through there. So with the remaining pigment. I'm just going to bring that down, cover as much canvas as I can, build layer number 2, like so. I will grab a little bit more water because we do want that to keep the bristles nice and tight, but now we can go back to rendering much more intentional sharp markings. There we go. We'll do a different type of tree right here. We'll do a brother for it. Build a bit of a cohesive nature amongst them. Yet again, ran out of paint. Going to add some protrusions. And fill that in. Now, can't forget about this corner. See that I'm rotating my brush. It's always in the air. We don't rotate it on the canvas because then we create streaks rather than taps. Expand that up. There's quite a bit in the reference photo here, but I don't know that I really want that. I think I'll stick with this to live with it for a little while and see if I feel like it needs an expansion, because it might not. Here we're also covering quite a bit of our background. That's okay, don't worry about that. We painted the background in excess so that we had option as to where we expanding and where we didn't. You can see that this, and this are all very different shapes and sizes. Then of course we move into different trees. And speaking of different trees, let's put that big brush down, switch over to our liner, grab some pigment, and from here we can paint more of the tree that we have in the background. Still lots of little taps. I'm not doing a lot of dragging. Now, once all of that is fully dry, we're going to go back to the larger flat-headed brush, grab about an equal mixture of our green and our Mars black. Then we will interject more titanium white than we did previously. Back to a little bit of green. We're building it up to be not bright, but brighter than what it was. Then we'll switch over to the liner brush and we can start applying highlights. This can be done along the edges. You can create brand new leaves. But essentially we have the light coming from the back working its way forward, right? So it's going to wrap around these trees. The edges are going to be illuminated. And I think we can even go a bit brighter. More titanium white, more of the green. We don't want too much of the white without the green, because then we essentially risk really desaturating it. And that's not the goal here. So I'm working on top of a lot of those previous markings through simple taps. Also, I am rotating this brush a little bit in the air in between taps. It's a rounded brush, so you would assume that it doesn't really have an impact, but different portions of the brush will have varying amounts of paint. So it does help a little bit. And then we can also move in, not dramatically, not too consistently, but there will be areas that protrude, and because of that, the light that's wrapping around will catch them a little bit. It'll lessen as we get more into the dense areas of the back. But there will be areas where it is prominent. We can do just a couple here in this negative space. And let's get you closer again. So this is really where we make these bottom portions look nice and three-dimensional. A lot of my movements are essentially wrapping around what could be a new larger cluster, even a new tree, slightly closer to us. I like to create more spaced out applications initially, and then we bring them in together. That way it isn't an early overcommit to filling out a space. Because you can have some that are just kind of out in the middle of nowhere and they look great, but if you have a lot in a singular area, then that can be a bit more questionable, right? So it's just safer to start with a wider application. And then start amalgamating spots. You can really fill out portions once you get comfortable. And once you have a couple spots pre-articulated, because then you have a much better idea of how much detail you actually want and the shapes of a lot of these trees. Here we're building out potentially another one. Again, I am deviating from the reference photo just because I'm trying to aid the grander look of the painting. I always feel like reference photos are a great tool to show you something that you wouldn't have assumed was there, to get you out of that look that can be a little bit cartoony, because there's so many pieces that we just wouldn't inherently consider. But I also don't like to absolutely live by the reference photo. I like it to be an aid, not a handcuff. So we use it to expand our knowledge of the subject, but we don't keep us from getting creative. Lots of little taps. There we go. You can see that I'm slowly working my way towards the left. And in this process, I'm going back continuously, building up the higher portions. Especially as we add more down here, we need to be mindful that it now only makes sense that the top is even brighter and more full. Lightning's predominantly over here. We can get a little bit less light towards the left. Not dramatically, because it's not like it's a straight line of light. It's much more spread out, but it will have a slight impact because the angle is changing in which our subject is facing that lighting. Applications in this tree are a bit more horizontal with a slight bend than they are just taps, but there are taps included. Then we can overlap more of the chapped foliage towards the bottom. Lots of little micro decisions that build up into something we can really take pride in and care about. Now, yet again, we'll get a little bit farther back and we'll grab some extra titanium white, some extra green, and we'll create a brighter mixture for some greater highlights that we'll do predominantly towards the top here, as you can see. Not going over all of our previous applications, just the ones that might really experience that flash of light. More towards the edges. That said, this is definitely too bright, and that's okay. Just grab some Mars Black, work it over. Still nice and bright, but not too bright. And we're just doing micro adjustments. Dancing around, applying where it makes sense. Predominantly right-hand sides of these trees. Little taps on the left hand to a smaller degree. And we'll let it dissipate as we move towards the right. But we keep it subtle. Trying to hold my brush fairly far back and stand fairly far back. That way I have a better true view of how it looks. Again, little updates. More taps on this tree than lines with this highlight, just because the lines could look a little bit too dramatic. Maybe we'll move it in a little bit, not much. But you can see how all these various layers build that texture, build that volume. Now, after seeing how bright this gets, I do want to go back and work on the clouds a bit more. So let's get a little bit closer, yet again. Now, the clouds right down here look a little bit messy because they are, and they definitely need more layering, especially if you look at it in contrast with everything around. So we're going back to the filbert brush. We'll make sure that's nice and damp. We'll grab some of our, I believe it was pale terracotta, a little bit of the deep violet, titanium white, grabbing from a clean spot on the palette, not an area that has the green or Mars Black mixed into it, though we do need a little bit of Mars Black because we don't want something too bright for the first application here. And we'll see just how this works in relation. I think that it's a pretty color, but I think it's a little bit too bright, and I also want my mixture to be less watery. So we'll go in, we'll mix more paint this time. We still will use titanium white because we want to thicken it, but we won't use as much, and we'll use slightly more Mars black. Bring those together. It's a bit more muted. We can tap that along the edges of these smaller clouds. And then we can go back over here. Predominantly working on the top and the right hand sides, because of course that is where the light is going to be touching and working around. I think it's already working steps in the right direction. Here we have an opening, so towards the left hand side, because that's the area that's being kind of adorned by the light there. We can do a slight blend back, either with our brush or with our finger. Extend that out. And then here you can see that I'm just slowly building it up till we get back into this larger spot. Let's make it a bit brighter, just by adding in more of the terracotta or pale rose hue. Doing a soft blend back with the corner. Not all of the clouds need to have the same level of illumination, so I'm actually not going to do all of the smaller ones. That way we'll go back here and just brighten that minorly. If you want, you can throw this towards the top, but I think I'm actually quite happy with the rendering up here and that general contrast that we have. That said, every time we apply it down here, we build it up. We can even incorporate little taps so that it feels like it's rounded, and then in that rounding there's little pieces that come out and they catch light. And now we have almost a shelf-like effect where it goes like that. Very unique. Not in the reference photo, but I think a strong addition. There we go. We can also go back to more of that darker purple hue that we used for this, and just put on a new thick layer, because as noted previously, what this really needed was more pigment. You can see the canvas showing through in small portions here and there. I'm just trying to alleviate that. I don't want it to be too dark, so we'll taper how dark it is. Made it a little bit too gray there. Towards the edges. Blend it back. Create a nice transition. You can tell that we're just slowly modeling it into something we really love. That said, keeping the edges darker like this is great for that vignette effect we talked about. And we can expand that too. Maybe a little bit over here. You can see that we can also just tap in extra little clouds, nice and easy. Let's brighten it. Go over this again. And I think we'll switch to the liner brush. To get some real detail work. Might be too bright. And if it is, I'll just redarken it. But I think there's a chance that this will work really well. And the beauty of acrylics is that we can try these things, and if they don't work, it's okay. It's very easy to walk backwards, just paint another layer. We can do that if necessary. Might work a little bit of it through here. It's not that we're necessarily outlining, we're just bringing highlight to all of the areas that will adopt it, right? And it'll become less and less as you move this way, but we can still have a hint of it in the opening. Color is so close to what we have through here that we can actually just open up spots as well. Continuously going back for more pigment and water. See, this is a technique and an application that we didn't have really at all previously. Now it's working its way through so many portions of the painting, elevating that detail. And this is why we don't worry so much in the beginning about how the painting looks, because so much of it happens later on when we maybe even think we're done with the subject. We do something else and we say, oh, you know, we could brighten that up there, and then we go and we do so, and it's a beautiful addition, right? Alright, so we did some additional layering through here. I think it's evident we also need to do it over there. So yet again, we have our terracotta, the deep purple, Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. We want it to be a bit more gray. That was our lesson from over there. But this one I want to be a bit darker towards that edge. And unfortunately we have to work around our foliage a little bit. That is the negative to going back and redoing subjects like clouds. But that's okay. We don't have too much foliage up here yet anyway. So we'll get a good thick application. Then we'll make it brighter via the terracotta and titanium white. Maybe a little bit of our purple. Slightly too bright, so we don't mix a massive amount at once. Closer. Using the round portion of our brush to blend, working it back a little bit into the foreground, softening edges. There we are. Already looking a little better. Here, could definitely use additional layering as well. Not too much, but a little bit of extra paint will help. You can also resize and shape pieces should you want to through here. Just blend that back into our previous mix. Having this area a bit brighter also makes a lot of sense with the lightning being as prominent as it is through this section. Using my pinky finger to ground my hand and remove shake. Now we're bridging the two sides. There we go. So many areas that can use little touch-ups here and there. We don't want to overwork our subjects, but I feel like often most people underwork rather than overwork. So if you're going to overcorrect in one way or the other, I feel like overcorrection is a little bit better. Well, you can always just walk it back, right? Now, we've reestablished some great layering in there. Switch back to our liner brush. Recreate some of those highlights that we were working around the edges of our clouds that might have gotten lost in that new application. And reapply. Now we are coming towards the end. I do like to give everybody who made it to the end a special little code word, something you can use in the comments to note very subtly that you are one of the, on average, 13% who makes it to the very end of the video. It's a fun little way to see who does continuously put in that time and effort. Also, for the record, very proud of you for sticking it out. I know that the painting did go through some awkward phases. If you're still here, I think that's a great sign for your own piece and your own patience with your own work. But today, I think our word will be vast. There's like a very vast landscape to me, kind of goes forever. We have all of these voluminous hills, distant mountains. So you can either just use that word in the comments, or you can incorporate it into a sentence. But that way I and everybody else who got here will know that you are, again, one of those dedicated 13%. Also, would like to take a minute to say a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for making longer lessons like this happen. Really couldn't do it without you. I actually ended up doing multiple lightning pieces, not uploading, because I felt like it could be better, it could be better, it could be better. Here is the one that we've landed on that I'm quite proud of and I think makes for not only a good painting, but a good lesson. And again, it's because of you that I don't have to always upload the first rendition. I can continue to work on it, try again, make it into something that's better to learn from, or maybe just a better painting for you to work on. So big thank you to everyone up over on Patreon for making this lesson and all of the lessons like it happen. If you're new to the channel and you're interested, up over on Patreon, again, you can get the traceable for this. You can get the reference photo, pictures of all of the materials, paint tubes, all of that I use. You can get access to our exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their renditions. You get to find inspiration in how people are doing things differently, ask questions, learn alongside a great community. You can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. ebooks full of other traceables. There are also, again, little video reviews that I do of some of the patrons' artwork. So we just did that about a week and a half ago, where people at the Great Wide Open tier sent in images of their paintings. Then we took an hour and I just talked about what I would do with them, all of the pieces that were working, everything that they could take into future paintings, what we could work on. But it was really fun. Felt like art critiques back in university, all of which are of course very positive, but we also talk about how we can make things better too, right? Strike a balance. But all of that is up there. There's a link to it in the video description, where you can also find the brush set that I'm using and all of that good stuff. As well as the full material list is in the video description. I can't add pictures there, but I typed out all of the paints and the brands for them. So if you're not up on Patreon, you can still go and you can see everything that I'm using. Or read, rather. It's so hard to stop painting. It's just one of those processes that's a little too much fun, you know? That said, I know what I'm doing for the next painting. It's this big waterfall. I think we'll start with you know what? I don't want to spoil it. It'll be really good though. So if you haven't, make sure you subscribe. But again, big thank you to everybody who's here. Big thank you to everybody up on Patreon. I hope that this inspires you. I hope it teaches you something here and there. That you're excited to go out and work on your own version. That you have patience in your version, because that is such a virtue here. And that you have a wonderful time. So, thank you. And I'll see you next week with a brand new, bigger painting. That said, above all, as always, stay creative.